High above the cliffs of California's central coast, where the Pacific wind cuts through clouds and salt, stands a palace that once belonged to a dreamer who refused to be ordinary. It is called San Simeon, a name that whispers through the ocean mist like a legend. From a distance, it looks like a European mirage, a cathedral lost on American soil. Up close, it reveals something far more intimate: the architecture of obsession. Built of imported marble and crowned with towers that mimic old Spanish cathedrals, San Simeon was neither a home nor a fortress. It was a declaration, a monument raised by a man who believed that money could buy not just comfort, but eternity. That man was William Randolph Hearst, the press baron who taught a young century how to see itself through ink and spectacle. To the world, he was a genius of persuasion. To his enemies, a manipulator of the masses. And to himself, a builder of empires both visible and imagined. At the height of his power, he owned dozens of newspapers, magazines, and radio stations. His words reached every corner of the United States, shaping not just public opinion, but the very rhythm of modern life. He could make heroes or ruin reputations with a headline. He could sell war or peace with a paragraph. Inside San Simeon, where columns rose like the ribs of a cathedral and tapestries whispered from walls centuries old, Hearst entertained presidents, movie stars, and tycoons. His guests arrived in private trains, climbing the winding road to a hilltop where reality and theater blurred. They dined beneath ceilings carved in Italy, danced beside Greek statues under the California moon, and watched the man at the head of the table orchestrate every moment like a conductor of vanity and power. Hearst did not merely host. He directed. Every glance, every story, every gesture inside those walls was part of the mythology he built around himself. He collected everything: paintings, armor, antique manuscripts, even ceilings ripped from European monasteries, and arranged them as if to reconstruct civilization in his own image. But beneath the splendor, there was something fragile, a man haunted by his own success. Those who knew Hearst spoke of his restless energy, his endless search for approval, his refusal to stop building as if still trying to fill an emptiness that no empire could erase. In the glow of chandeliers and laughter, he remained curiously apart, watching the world he created as though he were both its author and its prisoner. His guests saw a titan, but his closest friends saw the boy he had never stopped being: the son of a miner and a schoolteacher, born between privilege and insecurity, forever trying to prove that his father's fortune had not been wasted on him. George Hearst, his father, had made his millions digging silver and gold from the American earth. William would mine something different: the raw emotion of the public mind. He understood, before most of his generation, that information could be a form of empire, and that empire could be disguised as entertainment. The late 19th century was an age of invention and anxiety, of telegraphs and revolutions, of cities rising and faiths collapsing. America hungered for heroes and villains, for stories that could make sense of its speed. Hearst gave it both. His newspapers did not simply report the world, they invented its rhythm. He turned the news into theater, the press into a stage, and the reader into a spectator of national drama. The result was intoxicating. His papers sold by the millions. His editors were celebrities. His rivals, like Joseph Pulitzer, watched in both admiration and alarm as journalism itself changed before their eyes. But even at the height of his triumph, there was an unease in Hearst's silence. When he walked alone through the gardens of San Simeon, past fountains guarded by stone lions and terraces lined with cypress, one could sense the melancholy of a man who had conquered everything except peace. The palace that bore his willpower also mirrored his isolation. Each sculpture, each painting, each priceless relic whispered of empires that had risen and fallen before his own. Hearst was fascinated by power because he feared its impermanence. He studied kings, emperors, and conquerors, not out of reverence, but curiosity. What made them fall? And could he escape the same fate? Perhaps that was why he built so high above the world, where the wind could not reach him and the ocean seemed like a mote of eternity. But time, as every empire learns, is undefeated. Visitors who once left San Simeon dazzled would later describe it as a place both magnificent and lonely, a palace built for company that never quite cured its master's solitude. And maybe that was the paradox of Hearst's life. The man who could fill pages with the lives of others could never find enough words to fill his own. He believed that legacy could be engineered, that history could be printed and bound, like one of his Sunday editions. But history has its own editors. The story of William Randolph Hearst is not just about a fortune or a newspaper. It is about America itself, its faith in ambition, its romance with excess, and its eternal struggle between dream and downfall. And as the wind still sweeps through the towers of San Simeon, carrying with it the echoes of music, laughter, and the press machines that once roared in his name, the tale of power must return to where it began, to the rugged hills of California, where gold was struck, where the Hearst name first gleamed in the dirt, and where a miner's son learned that the world could be conquered not by force, but by the stories men choose to believe. Before William Randolph Hearst learned to command words, his family had already mastered the language of the earth. The Hearst fortune began not with ink, but with ore, with the rough hands of George Hearst, a man who could smell metal in the dirt and see fortune where others saw dust. Born in a one-room cabin in Franklin County, Missouri, in the early 1820s, George was the product of a restless generation. His formal education ended before adolescence, but he had something far rarer, an instinct for geology so keen it bordered on mysticism. When the great California gold rush swept the nation in 1849, he packed his tools, crossed the plains, and headed west. Chasing not just wealth, but destiny, California rewarded him. After years of hardship, George struck silver in Nevada's Comstock Lode, one of the richest mineral veins ever discovered in North America. He invested his winnings in copper in Montana's Anaconda mine, and later in gold in South Dakota's Homestake, which would become the largest and most productive gold mine in the United States. Each discovery transformed him from a prospector into an industrial baron. By the 1870s, George Hearst's name was synonymous with success, a self-made millionaire who rose from mud and grit to join the ranks of California's power elite. Yet, even as he amassed wealth, George remained the archetype of the frontier man. Gruff, pragmatic, uncomfortable in silk collars, and suspicious of anything that couldn't be measured on a scale. His wife, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, could not have been more different. Born in the same Missouri countryside, she possessed an education her husband never had, and a moral compass finely tuned toward enlightenment. Where George saw the world as something to be conquered, Phoebe saw it as something to be cultivated. She believed in education, art, and the responsibility of privilege. When the family moved into their grand home on Chestnut Street in San Francisco, she filled its halls with books, music, and conversation, inviting scholars and missionaries rather than prospectors and politicians. It was she who taught young William that the mind could be mined as deeply as the earth, that curiosity could yield its own kind of treasure. William grew up between two forces, his father's empire of extraction and his mother's empire of ideas. From George, he learned ambition. From Phoebe, aspiration. Their contradictions would later become the blueprint for his own personality, part ruthless capitalist, part romantic idealist. He was a boy of privilege, but also of purpose, sensitive yet driven, shaped by the awareness that his family's fortune had been pulled from the bones of mountains. He idolized his mother, who saw potential in him beyond business. She introduced him to literature, art, and travel, encouraging a curiosity about the wider world. By the age of 10, William had already accompanied her to Europe, where he stood awestruck before the cathedrals and museums of Paris, Florence, and Madrid. Those early impressions would never leave him. Decades later, when he began building San Simeon, he was not simply constructing a mansion, he was recreating the Europe of his childhood memory, a physical manifestation of awe and control. But his relationship with his father was more complicated. George was proud of his son's intellect, but wary of his extravagance. He respected effort, not imagination. In his eyes, the only real value was tangible: gold, silver, copper, land. Words and ideas were for dreamers, and dreamers went broke. Their dinners often ended in silence, Phoebe trying to bridge two temperaments that could never fully understand each other. William longed for approval, but George offered only challenges. When William entered Harvard College in 1885, he arrived with all the confidence money could buy. He was charming, well-read, and eager to leave behind the provincial world of mining towns. Harvard, though, was both a revelation and a battlefield. He immersed himself in art and literature, joined exclusive clubs, and edited the Harvard Lampoon, where he discovered the intoxicating rush of publication. The Lampoon was more than a student magazine. It was a playground of influence. For the first time, William realized that wit and design could shape opinion just as surely as politics could. He redesigned the paper's layout, wrote biting satire, and tripled its circulation. He was, in miniature, rehearsing the empire he would later build. But his ambition soon collided with authority. He spent more time curating pranks than attending lectures, most infamously, sending professors silver chamber pots engraved with their names. It was audacious, extravagant, and unmistakably Hearst. Harvard expelled him in his junior year. Phoebe was devastated. George was unsurprised. Yet the incident revealed something essential about their son. He couldn't abide limits. Rules were obstacles to be rewritten. After returning home to California, William faced a choice: fade into the shadow of his parents' fortune, or carve something entirely his own. The opportunity came in the form of a failing newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, which his father had acquired to settle a gambling debt. To George, it was a liability. To William, it was a challenge. He convinced his father to let him run it. With characteristic audacity, he invested his inheritance into the paper, upgrading its printing presses and hiring the best writers and illustrators he could find. Under his direction, the Examiner came alive. He introduced vivid illustrations, investigative exposes, and bold typography that screamed from the page. The stories ranged from political scandals to human tragedies, all delivered with urgency and flair. Hearst had no interest in dull recitations of fact. He wanted drama, emotion, and participation. He turned reading the news into a sensory experience, a mirror in which ordinary citizens could see their hopes and fears magnified. This approach scandalized traditional journalists but electrified readers. Circulation soared. The working class embraced him as their champion, while the elites dismissed him as vulgar. Hearst didn't care. He understood something they did not: that journalism was no longer just about information, it was about influence. He wrote editorials attacking corruption, defended laborers against monopolies, and cultivated the image of a populist crusader, even as he lived like a prince. It was a contradiction that would define him for life. George Hearst, though impressed by the result, never fully approved. To him, his son's paper was entertainment, not enterprise. Their relationship grew strained as William spent more time crafting headlines than managing minds. In 1891, George died, leaving behind a fortune of millions and a son ready to reinvent what power meant in America. Phoebe, now widowed, stood by William's side, guiding him with her quiet strength and unshakable faith in culture. She endowed schools and libraries, while he built audiences and influence. She believed that knowledge would elevate mankind. He believed it could command it. By the mid-1890s, the Examiner was the most dynamic paper west of the Rockies. But California's reach was finite, and William's ambition was not. He began to look east, to New York City, where the giants of journalism battled for the nation's conscience. His rival was clear: Joseph Pulitzer, whose paper The World ruled the newsstands and defined modern reporting. Hearst admired him but also envied him. Pulitzer represented what William craved: national power and cultural legitimacy. He decided to challenge him head-on. In 1895, he purchased the New York Journal, setting the stage for one of the most infamous rivalries in American media. The battle between Pulitzer and Hearst would ignite an era of yellow journalism, where truth, spectacle, and manipulation collided on the front page. But before that storm, there was still the calm, the confidence of a young publisher stepping into history, armed with inherited wealth, learned ambition, and an unshakable belief that words could build an empire. As the printing presses of San Francisco roared late into the night, William Hearst watched the ink spill across the pages and felt the same thrill his father must have felt when gold first flashed in his pan, the thrill of creation, of discovery, of dominion. He had inherited a fortune carved from mountains, and now he was ready to mine something far more volatile: the human mind itself, for in the veins of public opinion lay a new kind of treasure, and Hearst was determined to claim it all. When William Randolph Hearst arrived in New York in the mid-1890s, he entered a city vibrating with noise, smoke, and ambition. The Gilded Age was reaching its final crescendo. The streets of Manhattan pulsed with electricity and promise. New skyscrapers clawed at the sky, and printing presses thundered day and night, feeding a nation addicted to words. To most men, it was chaos. To Hearst, it was an invitation. He had come east not merely to compete, but to conquer, to transform the capital of American journalism into the capital of his own empire. The battlefield had already been drawn. Joseph Pulitzer, the Hungarian-born publisher of The World, had turned newspaper reading into a national ritual. His paper exposed corruption, defended the poor, and gave reform a voice. But to Hearst, the World was not a monument, it was a target. In the year 1895, he purchased the New York Journal for $180,000, investing a fortune in new presses, color printing, and the boldest talent hunt the industry had ever seen. Within months, he had lured away Pulitzer's star writers and artists, doubling their salaries without hesitation. One editor later said, "Mr. Hearst does not build newspapers, he builds armies." And that was how he saw it. News was warfare, each headline a volley, each edition a campaign. Hearst's strategy was absolute. Enormous type, striking illustrations, and stories that blended fact with feeling until readers could no longer separate one from the other. He understood that America was no longer a nation of patient readers, but of restless spectators. The century to come would belong not to statesmen, but to storytellers. Under his command, the journal became a theater of the real. Crime, tragedy, and triumph all appeared side by side, framed with moral urgency and visual drama. He sent reporters into the tenements, the sweatshops, the city morgues, ordering them not to simply describe life, but to make it pulse on the page. "Don't just tell me what happened," he would say. "Make them feel it." His principle was simple: appeal to the heart, not merely the head. Readers responded with obsession. By the year 1897, the journal was selling nearly 1 million copies a day, overtaking Pulitzer's mighty World. Hearst had turned print into performance and journalism into emotion. But headlines were not enough. Hearst wanted power. The perfect opportunity came with the rising unrest in Cuba. Spain's colonial rule was collapsing, and stories of rebellion and cruelty began trickling into American papers. Hearst recognized the story's explosive potential. He sent the illustrator Frederick Remington and the correspondent Richard Harding Davis to Havana to cover the crisis. When Remington supposedly wired him that there will be no war, Hearst allegedly replied with the line that would define his legend: "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Whether he actually said those words no longer matters. What matters is that he could have. Hearst understood that perception could create reality, that if a nation could see an image vividly enough, it would begin to believe it. Through relentless headlines and illustrations, he turned Cuba's struggle into a moral crusade. When the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February of 1898, killing 266 sailors, the journal thundered, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy." The cry, "Remember the Maine," swept across America, and within weeks, Congress declared war on Spain. To his critics, it was proof that his papers had become dangerous weapons. To his admirers, it was proof that journalism could move history. Either way, the Spanish-American War transformed him from publisher to power broker. Soldiers carried his papers into battle. His correspondents became national heroes. When victory came, America gained an overseas empire, and Hearst gained a moral one. Flush with influence, he expanded relentlessly. By the first years of the 20th century, he owned major newspapers in Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, along with magazines like Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and Harper's Bazaar. Each carried his signature: dramatic design, emotional storytelling, and a belief that news should feel alive. He built an editorial network so vast that a story written in New York could echo by dawn in every major American city. The Hearst name had become a brand synonymous with energy, spectacle, and reach. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a genuine idealism. Hearst believed the press should serve the people against the powerful. His papers exposed corruption, campaigned for labor reform, and attacked monopolies. He supported workers, immigrants, and the poor, even as he dined with kings. It was a contradiction he never resolved, one that made him both revered and mistrusted. Politicians feared him, reformers courted him, the public devoured him. In the year 1902, Hearst carried his crusade into politics, running for Congress as a Democrat from New York's 11th District. He won easily, promising to represent the people who buy the papers, not the people who own them. In Washington, he was treated as an exotic, a millionaire populist, a publisher in a politician's suit. He fought for antitrust legislation and public ownership of utilities, earning praise from progressives and suspicion from party bosses. Some saw him as the new voice of reform, others as a dangerous showman. But Hearst's hunger was not satisfied. In 1905, he ran for mayor of New York City and lost narrowly amid allegations of vote tampering. 2 years later, he sought the governorship of New York but fell short again. The defeats stung deeply. For the first time, he confronted the truth that money could buy attention but not loyalty. Politics demanded patience. Hearst lived for immediacy. The stage he had built for himself was too vast to share. Yet even as he faltered in politics, his media empire continued to bloom. The early decades of the new century were his golden years. He expanded into motion pictures, sensing cinema's power before Hollywood itself matured. He founded the International News Service, a rival to the Associated Press, extending his reach overseas. He modernized his magazine division, pioneering bold photography and design that would influence publishing for generations. Amid this whirlwind, his life took a turn toward romance and scandal. In 1917, Hearst met Marion Davies, a young Broadway actress barely 20 years old. He was 54, married, and already a legend. Yet between them formed a partnership that defied both convention and expectation. Marion was vivacious, warm, and genuinely kind, everything Hearst's world of politics and power was not. He adored her, financed her films, and surrounded her with affection. She brought laughter into his solemn world, and he gave her a kingdom to reign in. Their relationship was whispered about in high society, but inside San Simeon, it was simply the center of his life. By the roaring 1920s, Hearst's influence reached its peak. His empire included 28 major newspapers, 18 magazines, and radio stations in every major market. Editors referred to him simply as Chief. His telegrams to newsrooms, short, imperious, and cryptic, could redirect the course of national conversation. In California, construction on San Simeon accelerated. What began as a ranch had become a myth in stone and marble. Shiploads of artifacts arrived from Europe. Gothic fireplaces, Renaissance tapestries, Roman sculptures. Each room bore a different century. Visitors likened it to a museum that had decided to live. The gatherings there were legendary. Movie stars like Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, and Greta Garbo mingled with politicians, financiers, and foreign dignitaries beneath ceilings carved 500 years earlier. There were polo matches on the lawns, costume balls under the chandeliers, and private film screenings in the Marble Theater where Marion's latest movies played before their release. To be invited to San Simeon was to step into a dream, a world curated by one man's will. Yet for all its brilliance, the dream carried its own weight. Hearst was never able to stop building. He directed his architects with obsessive precision, editing blueprints as if they were newspaper pages. He rarely slept, dictating memos late into the night, pacing among his relics while others danced. The palace reflected his psyche, magnificent, excessive, and unsettled. Even in triumph, he seemed haunted by the silence that followed applause. Behind the opulence lurked danger. Hearst's expansion was fueled by loans, millions borrowed against the promise of perpetual growth. Paper costs soared, competition intensified, and economic winds shifted. Advisors begged him to slow down. "You can't economize greatness," he told them. He believed momentum itself was power. By the late 1920s, America mirrored his optimism. The nation was drunk on progress. The stock market climbed without end. Hearst's papers glorified invention, luxury, and modernity. He was not just reporting the age, he was defining its mood. His name was synonymous with confidence. Yet beneath the gold leaf, cracks were forming. As he once wrote privately, "Empires are built on daring, but kept alive by faith, and faith is the first thing to fade." He could feel that faith fading as the decade drew to a close. The same restless energy that had built his empire now began to turn inward, feeding anxiety. but he refused to see it. The parties continued. The headlines blazed. The presses roared. Then, in October of 1929, Wall Street collapsed. The age of endless ascent was over, and the man who had embodied it stood on the edge of a reckoning. Yet as the light still glittered over San Simeon, and the Pacific wind carried the laughter of guests across the terraces, Hearst remained unaware that the same power that had made him untouchable would soon make him tragically alone. The crash of October in the year 1929 shattered not only Wall Street, but the very foundation on which William Randolph Hearst had built his empire. For more than 3 decades, his rise had mirrored America's own ascent, bold, boundless, and blind to the idea of limits. But the Great Depression brought everything down to earth. Advertisers vanished overnight, circulation dropped, and the rivers of credit that had fueled Hearst's expansion ran dry. What had once seemed infinite suddenly revealed its fragility. San Simeon still sparkled on the hill, but its marble halls echoed differently now. The laughter of guests grew rarer. The music from the ballroom quieted. Behind the facade of grandeur, Hearst's empire was drowning in debt, more than $100 million owed to banks that no longer believed in dreams. His fleet of 28 newspapers and 18 magazines, once the envy of the world, became anchors pulling him into insolvency. For the first time, the man who had once controlled the headlines now found himself at their mercy. Yet Hearst did not retreat. His instinct always was to fight. He slashed salaries, closed weaker publications, and mortgaged vast portions of his art collection to keep the presses running. He even cut back on San Simeon's construction, though he could never quite bring himself to stop it entirely. To halt creation, for him, was a kind of death. The estate became both refuge and reminder, the gleaming proof of what ambition could build and what excess could undo. As the nation suffered, the tone of his newspapers changed. Once champions of progress and spectacle, they grew sharper, angrier, more suspicious of authority. Hearst turned his attention to politics again, attacking President Herbert Hoover and later Franklin Delano Roosevelt with ferocity. He accused Roosevelt's New Deal of creeping socialism, warning that government aid would breed dependency. Ironically, many of his readers, working-class Americans who relied on his populist rhetoric, now embraced Roosevelt as their savior. The same audience Hearst had once inspired began to drift away. By the early 1930s, his political isolation deepened. Once courted by presidents, he now found himself caricatured as a relic of the Gilded Age, a man out of step with the new America struggling to survive. In retaliation, he used his empire to wage war against what he saw as national weakness. His editorials thundered against communism, labor unions, and foreign entanglements. He demanded strength, self-reliance, and patriotism, but his voice no longer carried the same moral weight. The public had changed, Hearst had not. Inside San Simeon, Marion Davies watched the transformation with quiet concern. The woman who had once brought laughter to his empire now became his anchor in solitude. She stayed by his side through every crisis, using her fortune carefully managed from her acting career to cover his personal expenses when his own accounts ran dry. It was a reversal of roles few could imagine, the actress saving the magnate. Yet she did it without complaint, out of loyalty and love. To the outside world, Hearst still projected the image of command. He continued to host select guests, politicians, movie stars, and old allies, but the gatherings lacked their former vitality. The Great Hall, once filled with the clinking of glasses and bursts of conversation, now often stood dim between visits. Servants kept the fires burning in anticipation of a host who wandered the corridors at night, dictating editorials into a recorder, his voice echoing through stone. Financially, his empire began to fracture. The Hearst Corporation's creditors, led by the Chase National Bank, grew impatient. In 1937, after years of negotiation, they forced a drastic reorganization. Hearst, once the unchallenged monarch of American media, was stripped of direct control. His properties were placed under the management of trustees to ensure repayment of his enormous debts. Technically, he remained the company's figurehead, but the power that had defined his life, the ability to command, to decide, to shape, was gone. It was a humiliation that cut deep. The man who had once dictated the national mood now needed permission to sign a check. Even the employees who had once feared his telegrams began to pity him. Yet Hearst bore the loss with a curious dignity. He continued to write columns and editorials, often defending traditional values or warning of foreign threats, but his words no longer moved mountains. They drifted like echoes of a fading voice in a louder world. As Europe descended into the chaos of the late 1930s, Hearst's worldview hardened. He despised fascism, yet feared communism even more. He denounced Adolf Hitler's aggression while simultaneously warning against American intervention. His papers oscillated between isolationist caution and patriotic fervor, mirroring a country divided against itself. For readers who had grown up idolizing him, it was painful to watch the man of certainty become the man of contradiction. Amid this turmoil, San Simeon persisted as both sanctuary and symbol. Hearst retreated there for long stretches, surrounded by relics of a civilization he had tried to recreate. The marble pools, the frescoed ceilings, the manicured gardens, all bore silent witness to his decline. He would walk the terraces at dusk, gazing toward the Pacific horizon, as if searching for an answer in the distance. Sometimes he would stop beside the Neptune pool, its reflection trembling in the wind, and say softly to Marion, "It's beautiful, isn't it? It should have been enough." But it never was. His appetite for control for creation could not fade completely. Even as his health weakened and his wealth diminished, he dictated editorials railing against waste and weakness. He lectured on the moral decline of Hollywood while quietly funding Marion's films. He condemned political excess while preserving his own palace of extravagance. The contradictions that had defined his rise now defined his fall. The coming of the Second World War in 1939 brought a strange form of redemption. The circulation of his newspapers rose again as Americans sought news of the conflict. Hearst, ever the patriot, supported the war effort wholeheartedly once the United States entered the fight. He donated paper, printing materials, and editorial space to national unity campaigns. For a brief moment, the man who had once been accused of dividing the nation now helped rally it. But the renewed prosperity came too late to restore what he had lost. By the time the war ended in 1945, the world that had once belonged to him no longer existed. Radio had overtaken newspapers as the voice of immediacy. Television loomed on the horizon. The public he had once enthralled had moved on to new storytellers. Hearst, now in his 80s, remained at San Simeon, his empire largely in the hands of the trustees, his influence reduced but not forgotten. He was still respected, even revered, but more as a monument than a man. Those who visited him in those years described a gentler figure, older, slower, and haunted by reflection. The booming voice had softened, the fierce eyes had dimmed. Yet when conversation turned to journalism, he would revive, leaning forward, recalling the days when words could move armies. He spoke of the journal's triumphs, of Cuba, of politics, of the times he had felt closest to greatness. Then, almost as if catching himself, he would smile faintly and add, "It was all so fast. We thought it would last forever." For Marion Davies, those twilight years were bittersweet. She remained devoted, hosting smaller gatherings to keep his spirits alive. The parties were fewer, the laughter quieter, but the affection deeper. Guests often found her at his side during meals, reading him letters or news clippings, while he listened, nodding slowly. Their bond, once the subject of scandal, had matured into something serene and unbreakable. By the early 1940s, Hearst's health began to fail. He suffered from heart disease and hypertension, but refused to leave San Simeon permanently. Only in 1947, when his condition became critical, did Marion persuade him to move to their Beverly Hills home. He resisted until the end, reluctant to abandon the hill that had defined his life. To leave San Simeon was, in his mind, to concede that the dream was truly over. On a quiet August morning in the year 1951, William Randolph Hearst died in his bed, surrounded by family and by Marion, who held his hand until the end. Outside, the California sun rose as it always had, gilding the palm trees in the sky, the same light that had once danced across his marble terraces. The empire he left behind was not the same one he had built. Its scale had shrunk, its reach diminished, but its essence endured. His newspaper still printed, his magazines still sold, and his company, though now governed by others, still bore his name. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from around the world. Some praised him as the pioneer of modern journalism, the man who had democratized information. Others remembered him as a symbol of excess, the embodiment of an age when ambition outpaced ethics. Few agreed on his legacy, but none denied his impact. The press, as the world knew it, would never have existed without him. San Simeon, his palace of dreams, stood silent. The fountains still ran, the tapestry still glowed, but the man who had animated them was gone. Workers moved quietly through the halls, dusting statues, polishing marble, keeping the illusion alive. From a distance, the estate looked unchanged, but up close, something vital had departed the heartbeat that had turned stone into story. Marion outlived him by a decade and a half, preserving his memory with loyalty and restraint. She rarely spoke publicly about their life together, dismissing gossip with grace. "He was my best friend," she said once, "and he built a world for me. I just kept him company in it." After her death, her estate donated millions to charity, echoing Phoebe Hearst's legacy of generosity, a full circle that William himself might have quietly admired. And so ended the saga of the man who tried to hold the modern world in his hands. His empire had been born in ambition, expanded through daring, and undone by excess. Yet even in failure, it left behind something permanent. The realization that information, the stories we tell, the emotions we stir had become the true currency of power. For better or worse, William Randolph Hearst had shown the 20th century how to spend it. He had begun as the son of a miner, seeking approval from a father who measured worth in ounces of gold, and ended as a titan who measured it in words read and hearts moved. But in the end, the same drive that had raised him above kings brought him face to face with the solitude he could never escape. And as the waves broke endlessly below the cliffs of San Simeon, washing against the rocks where his palace still stands, the story of his power faded into something quieter, a meditation on ambition, legacy, and the cost of believing that the world itself could be edited into perfection. By the time the great presses of Hearst's empire slowed their rhythm in the early 1940s, William Randolph Hearst himself was already a ghost of his former force. The man who had once been called the voice of America now spoke from behind the veil of age, power diluted by creditors, his authority absorbed into the very institution he had built. He had lived long enough to watch his empire become something he no longer controlled, self-sustaining, faceless, efficient. For a man who had built his life on instinct and willpower, that loss was unbearable. From his residence in Beverly Hills, Hearst followed the affairs of the world with the same vigilance that had once driven him. He rose early, dictating memoranda, giving instructions to editors who still deferred to him more out of reverence than obligation. Each morning, a stack of his own newspapers awaited him on a silver tray. He would read them silently, marking headlines in red pencil, murmuring comments under his breath. "Too timid," he would say, "too sentimental." Even in decline, he still edited the world. But the tempo around him had changed. The pulse of America no longer came from printing presses. It came from radio waves and the flicker of television screens. The medium he had ruled was being eclipsed by voices he could not command. He understood what that meant, and it haunted him. He once told an associate, "When people stop reading, they stop remembering." It was both an observation and a confession that his legacy depended on a public that no longer existed. The Hearst Corporation, reorganized by the trustees in the late 1930s, continued to operate profitably, but Hearst's personal finances remained precarious. Most of his income went to servicing debt. To maintain San Simeon, staff and collections were reduced. Rooms once filled with guests were shuttered. The estate became a monument to an age that refused to end silent but defiant. He still kept the fountains running, the gardens trimmed, the lights on through the night. To those who visited, the sight of the illuminated castle above the dark coastline seemed almost supernatural, like the glowing memory of an empire that refused to sleep. Visitors who saw Hearst in those years described a figure both diminished and dignified. He moved slowly, his once commanding voice softened but not lost. His manner remained courteous, though the old spark of humor had dulled. Marion Davies, always near, guarded him with tenderness. She shielded him from business matters, handled correspondence, and arranged quiet evenings with small groups of loyal friends, actors, writers, and editors who still spoke of the old days as if they had happened yesterday. There was something tragic in the contrast between the man and the myth. In public imagination, Hearst remained the tycoon who had built palaces and started wars. the inspiration for Citizen Kane, a film he despised and tried desperately to suppress. He viewed Orson Welles' portrayal as an act of betrayal, a distortion of everything he valued. But the irony was cruel. Welles's fictional Charles Foster Kane, lonely amid his grandeur, had captured something Hearst could never escape: the unbearable solitude of power. When the film premiered in the year 1941, Hearst banned every mention of it from his newspapers. Yet privately, he could not stop others from talking. The legend he had spent a lifetime controlling was now beyond his reach. History, however, is rarely merciful, and even less obedient. As the Second World War intensified, Hearst's own relevance faded further. His health weakened. His influence waned. His empire endured only because it had grown strong enough to survive its founder. Editors who once trembled at his telegrams now made decisions without consulting him. The young executives, educated in the new pragmatism of corporate America, saw him as a relic, the last emperor of a vanishing age. Still, even stripped of authority, Hearst clung to the rituals that had defined him. He read proofs, revised editorials, and dictated letters filled with advice no one had asked for. He spoke often of loyalty, integrity, and courage, words that had guided him once but now sounded like relics themselves. When his strength failed him, he retreated to the balcony overlooking the Pacific, watching the sun sink beyond the horizon as if measuring the distance between memory and oblivion. The empire he left behind was no longer his, but it was undeniably him. Its reach extended into every aspect of American culture, from politics to fashion, from entertainment to opinion. His papers had shaped the modern concept of mass communication. His methods had transformed journalism from a profession into an industry. Yet the cost of that transformation was written across his final years: isolation, debt, and the quiet ache of irrelevance. For Marion Davies, those years were a devotion without expectation. She sold properties, liquidated investments, and used her own resources to maintain his dignity. When Hearst's creditors pressed harder, she provided funds discreetly, ensuring that he would never know how close he had come to ruin. To the end, she refused to let the world see his weakness. "He was always the chief," she said later, "and the chief never failed." In the spring of 1947, Hearst's health declined sharply. Doctors insisted he leave San Simeon for Los Angeles, where medical care would be easier. It took months of persuasion before he agreed. On the day of departure, the household staff lined the drive as his car rolled slowly down the hill. Some wept openly. He waved to them through the window, a faint smile on his lips as the towers of San Simeon disappeared behind him. It was the last time he would ever see them. In Beverly Hills, he spent his final years surrounded by family, by Marion, and by the filtered light of California mornings. The rooms were smaller, the world quieter, but the rhythm of habit continued. He still read his newspapers daily, marking margins with that same red pencil. He still dictated notes to editors. And he still believed, until the very end, that the press had the power to redeem society even if society no longer believed it itself. When he died in August of 1951, the nation paused. Obituaries across the world described him with awe and ambivalence. The New York Times called him a titan of the press, a man who changed the face of modern journalism. Others wrote more cautiously, calling him the architect of both enlightenment and excess. Few denied that he had given the 20th century its voice, even if that voice had sometimes shouted too loud. After his death, San Simeon was closed to the public for nearly a decade. The gardens grew wild. The fountains fell silent. It was as though the house itself were mourning. But in 1958, the Hearst family donated the estate to the state of California, transforming it into a public monument, the Hearst Castle, so that visitors could walk the same halls, gaze at the same art, and feel the same wonder that had once driven its creation. It became, at last, what Hearst might have secretly wanted all along: a story preserved, a vision immortalized. The Hearst Corporation, restructured and stabilized, thrived long after him. Under professional management, it expanded into magazines, broadcasting, and later television. The very technologies that had once threatened him became the instruments of his posthumous survival. By the late 20th century, the company was again one of America's most powerful media groups, a corporate phoenix rising from the ashes of its founder's obsession. For the man himself, there was no resurrection, only reflection. Those who visit San Simeon today often remark that the place feels alive, that even without him, it carries the echo of a restless mind. The laughter from the terraces, the flicker of old film reels in the theater, the scent of pine and ocean, all of it lingers like a memory refusing to fade. The walls, lined with relics of ancient empires, seem to whisper his story back to the living. The dream that built him, the ambition that consumed him, and the solitude that defined him. He had once declared, "You can build anything if you believe enough in it." He did. He built newspapers that shaped opinion, wars that reshaped nations, and a palace that outlived them both. But belief, like empire, is mortal. In the end, the man who taught America to crave headlines left behind the quietest one of all, a name carved not in marble, but in the collective memory of a century that learned from him how to worship information and how to lose itself in it. As the waves continue to crash below San Simeon's cliffs, carrying his legend out to sea like the final edition of a story that can never truly end. The story of William Randolph Hearst does not end with his death. It lingers, as all myths do, in the institutions, ideas, and contradictions he left behind. Long after the echo of his presses faded, his vision continued to define the architecture of power, not the kind built from stone and steel, but the invisible kind that shapes thought, desire, and belief. More than any man of his century, Hearst understood that information was the new gold, and he mined it until his last breath. Today, the Hearst Corporation remains one of the largest media enterprises in the world. Its holdings extend far beyond the newspapers that made him famous into television, magazines, digital media, and business ventures his era could never have imagined. From Cosmopolitan and Esquire to Harper's Bazaar and Elle, the company still speaks in the voice he created. Bold, confident, emotionally fluent, and endlessly adaptive. Every headline, every photograph, every carefully staged moment of modern media bears a trace of his legacy. The fusion of drama and message, of truth and presentation. But Hearst's greatest inheritance is more abstract. He taught the 20th century that storytelling could be an instrument of power, a way to mold nations and mobilize crowds. His innovations laid the groundwork for everything that followed: political propaganda, mass advertising, even the digital algorithms that now shape public consciousness. He blurred the line between information and persuasion, between journalism and performance, and in doing so, revealed both the potential and the peril of communication itself. To some, he remains the visionary who democratized news, who brought color, emotion, and immediacy to a medium once confined to the elite. To others, he is the man who opened Pandora's box, teaching the world how to sensationalize truth until truth itself became negotiable. Both views are correct, because both are his. Hearst contained multitudes, idealist and opportunist, patriot and provocateur, artist and autocrat. His empire was not simply a reflection of his ambition, it was the mirror in which modern society first saw itself. San Simeon, his palace of dreams, endures as the physical testament to that duality. Visitors walk through its echoing halls and see more than marble and art. They see the yearning of a man who tried to freeze time. The ceilings brought from Europe, the sculptures of forgotten gods, the gardens overlooking the endless Pacific, they all speak to the same desire: to preserve meaning in a world obsessed with movement. When the sun sets behind its towers, the light turns the stone golden, as if the past itself refuses to fade. In the silence of that hilltop, one can sense the ghost of Hearst walking the terraces, surveying the empire he built from words. He would recognize the world we inhabit, a world where headlines define reality, where stories outpace facts, where the line between influence and manipulation is as thin as a page of newsprint. He might even smile, not with pride but with understanding, knowing that the game he began has never truly ended. History often softens its verdicts. The anger of Hearst's critics has cooled. The awe of his admirers has mellowed. What remains is the paradox that defined his life: that greatness and excess are inseparable, that the drive to create often carries within it the seed of destruction. Yet there is something profoundly human in his story, the desire to leave a mark, to make the world remember, to build something that endures. For all his ambition, Hearst was not unlike the miners who came before him, sifting through the dirt of chaos in search of something shining, something eternal. His mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, once said that wealth without purpose was waste, and culture without conscience was vanity. Her son embodied both lessons and both warnings. He turned information into wealth, and wealth into culture. But conscience, that quiet companion of truth, was the one treasure he never learned to protect. And yet, even that failure gives his legacy weight. It reminds us that power without humility inevitably isolates, and that the pursuit of greatness without reflection leads back to solitude. Perhaps that is why San Simeon remains more than a museum. It is not merely a monument to excess. It is a monument to longing, the longing to be understood, to be remembered, to turn noise into permanence. Visitors stand on its terraces and gaze at the horizon, where ocean and sky merge into one. And they feel what Hearst must have felt, that everything magnificent is also fragile, that empire and emptiness are only different sides of the same dream. William Randolph Hearst built his palace on a hill so the world could see it, but in doing so, he made himself visible in ways he could never control. His empire rose, his influence spread, and his solitude deepened a lesson carved into the heart of the American century. The man who once promised to furnish the war, furnished instead a mirror in which every generation's sense has seen its own reflection, ambition, triumph, and the haunting cost of both as the wind still moves through the cypress of San Simeon, carrying with it the faint echo of printing presses that once believed they could outlast time itself. In the end, the story of William Randolph Hearst is not simply about a man who built an empire. It is about the timeless rhythm of creation and collapse that shapes every age. His name stands at the crossroads of ambition and consequence, a reminder that vision can build worlds but cannot protect the soul from its own echo. From the dusty mines of the California hills to the marble corridors of San Simeon, his life traced the arc of a nation from hunger to power, from noise to silence. He mined the earth, then he mined the mind, and in doing so, he discovered both the beauty and the burden of influence. His empire may have faded, but his questions remain. What is the price of greatness? What do we lose when we try to own the world's attention? San Simeon still stands against the Pacific wind, its towers gleaming in the sunset, its fountains murmuring softly in the dark. And somewhere in that stillness, the ghost of Hearst lingers, not in regret, but in reflection. The palace he built is no longer his. It belongs to history now, to the generations who walk its halls and ask themselves whether legacy is measured in what we own or in what we leave behind for others to see. At Legacy of Rich Dynasties, we tell these stories not to glorify the powerful, but to understand them, to uncover the fragile truth behind the marble and the gold. Because every dynasty, every fortune, every empire begins the same way, with a dream that refuses to die and a heart that forgets how to rest. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about ambition and legacy, we invite you to stay with us, to subscribe, to share, and to join this journey through the rise and fall of the world's most extraordinary families. Each story is a mirror, each name a lesson, and somewhere among them, perhaps, we may find our own reflection. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for remembering, because history is not what we leave behind, but what we choose to keep alive.